Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
The war in Ukraine is at an inflection point. Militarily, Russia continues to gain ground, although at a reduced pace and with a high rate of casualties, while Ukraine clings to its salient in the Kursk region of Russia. But it's around diplomacy that the war is changing most quickly. U.S. and Russian officials recently met in Saudi Arabia, cutting out America's NATO allies and Ukraine itself. That meeting was followed by a war of words between U.S. President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. To discuss both the military and diplomatic state of the war, I'm privileged to be joined today by Konrad Muzyka, Senior Fellow in FPRI's Eurasia program and the Director of Roshan Consulting, which provides consultancy and advisory services on the Russian and Belarusian armed forces. He holds an MA in Russian Studies from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College London. Between 2012 and 2019, Konrad worked at Janes as a military capabilities analyst, focusing on military developments in Central Europe and the post-Soviet space. Konrad, thank you for joining me on Chain Reaction today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here.
So you just returned from a visit to Ukraine. Give us a sense of where you went and your general sense of the military situation there at the moment.
Right. So a bit of introduction. I go to Ukraine every 3-4 months with Michael Kaufman, Rob Lee, and Franz Stefangadi. And we go to Ukraine to speak to Ukrainian officials, military commanders, and troops on the ground, essentially, just to get a sense of what is the frontline situation, what's the strategic overview on the war, what are the changes that are happening on a tactical scale? How are Ukrainians adapting? How are Russians adapting? And so on and so forth. So these trips, I think, are very fruitful and very needed to really understand what is happening in Ukraine and what the direction the war can actually take over the next few months. So we went at the beginning of February. We spent almost 2 weeks in Ukraine. We spent a few days in Kiev. And then we moved to the front line. We were in Sumy, Kharkiv, and the Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Pokrovsk areas. So the time that we actually spent near the front is much longer than what we actually spent in Kiev. Now, the overall military situation is such that Russia has been conducting offensive operations since the autumn of 2023. They continue to maintain a strategic initiative, essentially across the entire front line, while there are some areas where they are not as active. They maintain pressure on Ukrainian forces, essentially in the areas which they consider to be the priority for them. And in these areas, they have the preponderance of artillery, they have preponderance in fiber optic drones, and more importantly, in manpower. Ukraine is trying to adapt to the challenges posed by Ukrainian forces, but the truth is that they are really struggling to maintain ground in those key areas, and they continue to lose it, maybe not necessarily daily, but on a weekly basis. There could be some tactically significant changes occurring in these areas, which we will discuss in a few moments. So Ukraine has been trying to organizationally respond to the challenges posed by Russian attacks. The biggest problem that Ukraine has is mobilization and manpower. Okay, so we know that Ukraine officially continues to mobilize about between 20 to 30,000 men a month. But there are reasons to believe that they have problems with retention of personnel who's been mobilized. BBC News ran a story, I think, in December last year, when they said that the number of AWOL cases in the Ukrainian military was about 60,000. However, according to their sources within the Ukrainian general staff, the real number of personnel going AWOL was between 100 to 150,000. Now, the result is that essentially, even though Ukraine is conducting mobilization and is, in theory at least, filling units with manpower, you do not really feel it on the front line because the units continue to be significantly undermanned and unable, as a result, to conduct effective defensive operations. As a result, Ukrainian defense posture essentially hinges on drones and artillery. So these two things, I think, are very positive. Last year, Ukraine produced over 1.5 million drones of different types. And at the same time, while a year ago, there were big problems with the supply of artillery munitions, no such problems currently exist. And Ukraine is actually able to fire in some parts of the front, or they are able to achieve parity with the Russians in some parts of the front. And I'm talking here about 155 millimeter artillery rounds. So so that's very, very positive development. The battlefield is very transparent. Drones from both sides actually hover in the area constantly. Once Ukrainians see any sort of movement coming from the Russian side, whatever it is, whether it's Russians moving on foot or moving on motorcycles or tanks approaching, they immediately get suppressed with FPV drones or bomber drones. So while Russians continue to advance, they do it at a very steep cost in terms of manpower. But again, the problem is that it doesn't seem that their manpower levels are actually decreasing. So Russians continue to mobilize more than 30,000 men a month. These guys get very little training, about 2-3 weeks max, and then they get sent straight to the front. That's the source of the relentless Russian attacks, and that's the source of their tactical gains on the battlefield over the past, essentially, a year and a half.
So that's a really interesting perspective because, and thank you for that, because we've been hearing and reading so often that Ukraine faces a manpower problem, and usually what the purported problem is mobilization, right? They're not mobilizing enough people. But what I'm hearing from you, coming straight out of Ukraine, is that they're actually mobilizing people at a rate that would be sufficient to not only meet, but exceed their losses and allow them to hold ground, but for the retention or AWOL problem. So is there a solution at hand to the AWOL problem, right? Can they do something to retain people and keep them from going AWOL?
I think there is no short-term solution, to be honest. I think the solutions are long-term. And I think that Ukraine, or the political military leadership of Ukraine, realizes that in order to improve the atmosphere around the armed forces, they have to address some very well-known issues that the Ukrainian armed forces are having. So now we are talking about the highest commanders who know what they are doing, who speak to their troops who are on the front line. For instance, General Drapati has been nominated as the land forces commander recently. He's very well regarded across the entire land forces. I think every single brigade and battalion commander we spoke to, they spoke very highly of General Drapati. And they said that even though he's been in his position only for a few weeks, the morale across the force has already increased. But then again, that's not sufficient, because another part of the problem is the level of training. There have been numerous reports across Ukrainian media which said that when troops are mobilized, the training that they get on the MOD or the general staff training ranges is simply ineffective, insufficient, it's too short, and it does not really cover or even attempt to replicate the situation and the environment that soldiers will actually experience when they get deployed to the front line. So this issue is also being addressed. For starters, they increased the length of the basic training. It used to be 30 days. Now it's 45 days for basic training. Then troops get about 2-3 weeks, depends, but it's at least 2 weeks of specialized training. And then they get additional level of training when they get deployed to the respective brigades. So, so from 30 days a few months ago, now troops can get 2-3 months of training before they get deployed to the front line. Training instructors are also being replaced with those who have military experience, because surprisingly, that was also not the case a few months ago. And also brigade and battalion commanders who were previously on the front are being moved to advise Ukrainian politicians so that they fully realize what needs to be done to satisfy the needs of Ukrainian troops on the front line. And they are advising the decision makers to make specific amendments to how Ukraine should organize the functioning of its armed forces. Okay. So in theory, over the long term, this should improve the overall feelings that Ukrainian men have towards the armed forces. And that should decrease the number of AWOL cases. But I think it's also worth noting the difference between Ukraine and Russia, in that, yes, Ukraine has a AWOL problem. They are addressing it, but troops, let's say, have an option to go AWOL in the first place. Say, I cannot fulfill this order because I have too few men. Okay. What we heard from Ukrainians is that on the Russian side, the approach is very different. If you cannot fulfill your order, or if you don't want to, you are going to be shot on the spot. So you essentially have no choice, but you have to move forward. And I think one of Ukrainian commanders told us an anecdote that they listened to Russian conversation on radio, and one Russian commander said to his infantry personnel that if you move forward, there is 90% chance that Ukrainians will kill you, but if you move back to your position, there is 100% that I will.
Yeah, brutality has an efficiency all its own, doesn't it? Right? I mean,
Yes.
like you said, if Ukrainian soldiers, since murder is not a tool of military discipline in the Ukrainian armed forces, they have the ability or the chance to go AWOL. Whereas, we've been reading and hearing a lot about these blocking units in Russian formations and units that are behind units deployed to the front line that are instructed to kill soldiers who flee or retreat. So it was a great comprehensive overview of the military situation. I think, better and more concise than I think I've been able to get through weeks and weeks of sort of reading. So it sounds like you think there are potential fixes in the work. Those are going to take months at least to materialize. Is that about right?
Yes, that would be correct.
And then on the equipment side, because, we had heard so much a year and a half ago about significant equipment shortages on the Ukrainian side, especially with artillery shells because of the interruption of U.S. support. But my understanding is your assessment is now that has mostly been remedied. In other words, they're almost at parity with the Russians in terms of artillery munitions, and they've been able to make up a lot in terms of domestic drone production. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's also correct. I would like to stress again that we don't know how many artillery shells Ukraine will receive from the US going forward. So Ukraine may also face some shortages from April, maybe even when it comes to 155 artillery munitions. So it could be that, what Ukraine is currently actually firing may actually be a bit too much given the shortages that they may face in the future. So that's also, a point in discussion that actually came up when we were in Ukraine, that, the parity that Ukraine has reached over the past few months may actually be a bit too much in terms of what the future or planned deliveries of ammunition, especially from the United States.
Yeah, and so you said April or possibly May as an inflection point or a point at which their artillery munitions may not be as readily available as they are now. Would that be primarily due to a reduction in U.S. support that people are assuming is going to happen under the Trump administration, or was this sort of in the works already?
Well, I mean, if the United States or the Congress doesn't pass new supplemental aid, then there will be no new ammunition incoming. So everything hinges on what the Trump administration decides to do.
Let me move on and ask you for your military assessment. Are there certain parts of the front line, and you were in several different parts of the front line, but are there certain parts of the front line now that are more militarily significant or most militarily significant?
From the Ukrainian point of view, they are incredibly focused on what is happening in Kursk Oblast, because what they will want to do is they will want to leverage the terrain that they took in Russia in future negotiations with Russia and possibly the United States. The problem, however, here is that Ukraine, over the past few months, has lost about 60 to 70% of the terrain they control at the start of the incursion into the oblast. So they have, a relatively little area left, which makes it very difficult to actually support and supply. There is one road leading from Ukraine into Kursk Oblast through Suja. The road is covered with Russian FPV drones, especially those fiber optic cable drones. Okay, so what Russians are now attempting to do is they are attempting to sever the Ukrainian ground line of communications into Suja, and essentially they try to starve Ukrainians of ammunition and supplies. A few weeks ago, Ukraine launched a very limited counterattack southeast of Suja, which was relatively successful. But the problem is that Ukraine doesn't have enough, again, manpower, doesn't have second and third echelon forces to extend the advance and consolidate their gains. So essentially, what we are looking is the situation where Russia will continue attacking Ukrainian forces there. The Ukrainian presence there is actually necessitating the deployment of a significant part of resources, both manpower and artillery and drones, of course. But it is likely that given Russian FPV drone operations in the area, given that Russians drop 50 to 60 cabs per day into this area, it's likely that Russians will continue move forward and they will, slowly but steadily dislodge Ukrainians from their positions.
Not asking you to predict the future, which is always difficult, but you don't have a lot of optimism that Ukraine will be able to hold the salient or the foothold in Kursk that it currently has.
No, not really. I mean, it also depends what time frame we are looking at, and especially what time frame Ukraine is looking at. Because if you ask me, will Ukraine hold this terrain or a part of the salient over the next 2-3 months? I would say yes, it's likely. But are they going to hold it for the next 6 months or 8 months, a year? I wouldn't be so sure.
Yeah, and so since you mentioned timing, that's where diplomacy and negotiations potentially enter the scene as significant factors, right? Your visit, I think, coincided with the Munich Security Conference, where U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance spoke, and with a visit by U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth to the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. Both officials stressed that Ukraine should give up on the idea of restoring its territorial integrity and of joining NATO, at least in the foreseeable future. How did Ukrainians react to these statements when you were in Ukraine?
Well, I think, what we have to remember, and this also pertains to me personally, that we have to manage our expectations. And the reason why I say that is because I remember when General Kellogg gave his interview to Fox back, I think, in mid-November, I think before he was nominated as the Trump envoy to Ukraine and Russia. Now, he was pretty optimistic that, we will continue supporting Ukraine and so on and so forth. Although, of course, a lot of things were still in the air. but I think there was a sense of optimism, and I also displayed this optimism as a matter of fact, that the United States will continue supporting Ukraine in one form or another. Now, from strictly military point of view, Ukraine ability to retake the territory that they lost since 2022, let alone 2014, is just non-existent. So it's been clear that Ukraine will not be able to retake the territory, and its accession into NATO would be incredibly problematic, given that they will have a dispute with Russia over the territory in Ukraine. However, before we came to Ukraine, my personal sense was that Ukrainians were very much fixed on getting the membership into NATO as the only thing really that is going to provide them with security guarantees. So for Trump to call Putin first to speak about Ukraine without Ukraine and indicating that he's going to make some concessions on Ukraine's behalf was something that was really unexpected in Kiev. And I don't think that Ukrainians actually fully comprehended initially what happened and that they were in a state of shock. But, 2 weeks later or a week later, the situation has, somehow stabilized in that I think Ukraine realized that when Trump said that he wants to end the war as quickly as possible, it doesn't necessarily mean that he wants Ukraine to really be a part of the agreement, and he will be trying to force an agreement upon them. I think Ukrainians are now starting to fight against the United States and against how the United States actually plans to deal with Ukraine in the future. And now they fully realize that they cannot really fully rely on the United States as a leverage in their negotiations with Russia.
Yeah, I mean, Ukrainians, of course, weren't the only ones shocked to hear Trump and Trump administration officials say the things they said about restoring territorial integrity and joining NATO. Aside from being sort of unexpected, it's shockingly bad bargaining strategy because you just gave up two things before you ever sat down at the table. I would say leave aside the fact that Ukraine doesn't have the military potential to restore its territorial integrity right now. You should never give that up. Right. That's something you give up in the negotiations, not before them. Same with the NATO membership. Of course, it's very problematic. But, to give it up before you ever sit down across the table with your Russian interlocutors is just really bad bargaining strategy because it moves the bargaining space toward Russia's position. And it ensures that any agreement you do come to with the Russians will reflect Russian interests far more than U.S. interests, let alone Ukrainian interests.
So as a European, as a Polish citizen, the region has been full of different rumors about what Trump may have already agreed with Putin, the concessions that he is willing to make, which include some of the rumors are that the United States would withdraw its forces from the Baltic states and Poland and all the countries that were admitted to NATO since 1999. Even today on Polish Twitter, although I probably shouldn't be saying that, there was a rumor that the United States demanded Poland to maintain its army size to 4 divisions instead of planned 6, and that they will cut down the number of tanks that Poland has ordered from the United States. Okay, and that was apparently the message that has been received or delivered from Washington, D.C. over the past few days. So yes, the problem is there is no transparency. Don't really know what is going on, what's the state of negotiations, what is exactly that's being negotiated. And I think, as you mentioned, the fact that the Trump administration appears to have already made concessions before the negotiations began, I think was also one of the things that Ukrainians were shocked about.
I wanted to ask you, so last thing, and that is, let's assume a ceasefire of some sort is signed or is implemented and active fighting stops. Some Trump administration officials have said things to the effect that there needs to be security guarantees in place for Ukraine after a ceasefire, but they've been very clear that U.S. boots will not be on the ground. And the Russians have been very clear that it's a red line for them for forces from NATO countries, not not even mentioning a force under a NATO flag, but even a coalition of the willing that includes NATO countries is unacceptable to Russia. So how do you think we can square the security guarantees or deterrence circle in the event a ceasefire is signed? How can Ukraine be made secure, what's left of Ukraine after a ceasefire, be made secure? Because even this idea, for $500 billion in mineral concessions, well, U.S. companies are not going to come into Ukraine if it's subject to being reinvaded by Russia at any moment, right? So even that idea doesn't seem to have many legs unless there's security, some sort of security structure or framework in place.
Right. In this regard, Poland, for instance, the Polish government's unofficial position, at least what I heard, was that Poland is not going to deploy forces to Ukraine unless it is under the US command, because they want to ensure that if really there are troubles or if Russians do attack, whether accidentally or purposefully, Poland or any other country deployed into Ukraine will have the United States boots on the ground. Okay, so I think it's incredibly important for us to ensure that the United States troops are there. And if they are not there, currently nothing indicates that they will be there. I'm just not sure how this is going to work. We can talk about it on two levels, actually. The first one is purely military capability point of view. 30,000 troops, let's say 30,000 troops, taken from European NATO countries, so Poland, Germany, France, the UK, Spain, Italy, and the Nordic states. I think this is going to have a big impact on the regional security plans also. So that's a big problem. And no one can actually guarantee that if, for instance, Europeans withdraw their forces from the Baltic states, that Russia would actually do the opposite thing and deploy additional forces or any forces actually near the border with the Baltic states. Then from military capability point of view, we don't know what really the objectives are going to be. Is it going to be to stop Russia from invading Ukraine again? Or is it going to be to stop Russia from conducting, artillery strikes? What if there are, let's say, European troops east of Dnipro and Russia continues to attack Ukrainian infrastructure targets with Shahid drones? Nothing will actually change in terms of, let's say, air picture or in terms of artillery strikes. But I think also that Europe has a big psychological problem, which was clearly seen when there were discussions in Europe about the deployment of Taurus missiles to Ukraine and allowing Ukrainians to strike targets into Russia, because Europe was very undecided about what to do because the threat of escalation, how Russia would respond. I think Europe is not currently mentally capable of escalating situation vis-a-vis Russia. They are just too concerned about how Russia can potentially respond. And Russia sees that and they will play on their fears. So what I think, Europe should really do, if they really want to help Ukraine and if they do decide to deploy their troops into Ukraine, then to be fully committed and realize and make it public that we are willing and accepting all the costs that are going to be associated with this deployment, to ensure that Russia actually knows that Europe is there to defend Ukraine. And I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, but I think public diplomacy and to make it clear that we are there and we, if needed, we will fight, it's incredibly important, especially when you play against such an actor as Russia, who essentially lives on your fears and they can exploit them easily across the entire spectrum of warfare, from hybrid to conventional or even nuclear threats.
And of course, the nuclear card is one that Russia has played many times throughout this conflict in an attempt, at least partially successful attempt, to deter greater Western support for Ukraine. Conrad, I can't think of a better way to wrap this up than your last statement, which really sort of encapsulates the challenges of the post-war environment. So there are many challenges inherent in the war and challenges inherent in trying to get to a ceasefire. But even after a ceasefire, there are some really difficult questions that have to be answered for any ceasefire to hold and to be stable. I think you've done a masterful job of wrapping those up for us. So I want to thank you for giving so liberally of your time. You are one of the few people that actually spends a lot of time in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, but on the front lines with commanders, talking to soldiers. So that perspective is incredibly valuable. And I just, again, want to thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope to be back in the future.
Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.